Hello, my name is Stuart Robbins, and I'm going to be talking to you today about fully controlling Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter context camera images and producing cosmetically stable mosaics, the methods part. This is part of a two-part talk, the first part on the products I gave at the Planetary Mappers meeting a few weeks ago. So to start off with, why do we want to control our data? Well, what this is showing you is it's a portion of the moon where the yellow circle is a single crater at a set latitude-longitude position. In this case, I aligned it with the far left data set. But what you can see is that the crater image appears to move around when looking at different mosaics produced by a different camera. We don't want that. We want them to appear at the same location. So a controlled data set is one where all of those images would appear to be aligned properly. And controlled or fully controlled data sets would be where they're aligned to an absolute geographic reference system. For the moon, that's set up by the Apollo laser retroreflectors. But we also want to have these not only with a single data set, but with multiple data sets so that we can align them and compare them with each other more easily because you don't have these kinds of offsets. Now, per my title, we're talking about Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter CTX data for the rest of this talk. MRO has been in orbit of Mars since 2006, or about 15 years. The context camera on board is a visible light camera that's a line scan camera that's about 5,000 pixels wide and can produce very long images. To date, it's returned about 122,800 images of Mars, although there are more that aren't yet released to PDFs. It currently has just under 99% coverage of Mars with good quality images. The spacecraft is in a nearly circular orbit, producing 5 to 6 meter per pixel images for context camera, with roughly consistent lighting in most images over most of the surface. All of that means that this is ideal for making a controlled product. But that's a lot of data. In this case, processed the data, and it's about 55 terabytes to date, and the craft is still in operation, and the camera is still collecting images. So that's a lot to do. So why do we want to do this? Well, controlling CTX itself would be a massive resource to the Mars community. Once you have those images aligned with each other, or with themselves, then you can do things like automated change detection, which on Mars is pretty interesting. We can also align them with other data sets so you can do a lot of cross comparisons. But in more general, the ability to use automated software to control large data sets quickly is useful for most planetary imaging from archived, ongoing, and future missions. And we're only producing more data as we go along, so it would be good if we can actually control the data that we have. So why don't you want to do this manually? Well, it's really boring or annoying or mentally or emotionally or physically draining or painful. You pick your adjective. It is not a fun process. I'd rather be counting craters, but that's a separate issue. Then, with that said, even if you wanted to do this manually, funding agencies don't necessarily want to pay for human labor when a computer can do it for free, or whatever your institutional overhead costs. Plus, it's usually faster for a computer to do it. If it's not, your automated code needs work, or you should do it manually. If it's 1 to 2 images, do that manually. There's no point in really sticking an automated code on it if it's really small. But this case, we're dealing with really big. So, as an overview for our code, it is built around ISIS. The USGS program or program suite of ISIS is our back end. Our front end is that it's driven by a lot of Python. Now, not to minimize the work that I've done over the last, actually the work that we have done, our team has done over the last 3 years, but the code is effectively a glorified method of picking tie points between images, matching them up with each other, and then figuring out what didn't match correctly, all in as automated a way as possible. It then uses various tricks in order to speed things along. So for example, we've written or we use Python alternatives for some slow ISIS things like finding image overlaps that I'll talk about in a few slides. We can also split the work for most of the control process among multiple processors, scalable up to thousands of CPU threads for most of that work if you have the RAM available. We can also avoid some ISIS inefficiencies. For example, in developing our workflow, we found out that registering 2 points in one network is much faster than registering 1 point in 2 networks. And so we can leverage some efficiencies or inefficiencies depending on your point of view. So as an example of what it actually looks like, this is Tharsis Tholus. The mosaic at the left would be a mosaic just produced through a standard ISIS workflow. In the far upper right, you can see what a small region looks like, and you can see those offsets. In this case, these images are offset by about 250 meters or 260 meters. The middle image, we've done some cosmetic control, and in the next image, panel C, we've done a lot more cosmetic control, and we've done our cartographic control. That cartographic control is zoomed in panel E, and you can compare E and D and see the difference. You can also compare that to Themis, which is 100 meter per pixel instead of 5 to 6 meter per pixel. Now this is actually all I'm going to talk about with the cosmetic control process. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about our cartographic control process. The gist of the cosmetic control process is that what we do is we control the image brightnesses across the image to a much lower resolution but stable global mosaic. This was detailed with HRSC data in Michael et al. 2016, and we published our work on it with CTX last year, Robbins et al. 2020. Our current control process is summarized by this very complicated flowchart, which is actually only half of the flowchart. The other half goes off the bottom of the screen. Now, if you want to read this, go ahead and pause the presentation now. If not, then what I'm going to do is for the rest of this talk, just focus on this highlighted portion, this control network auto portion. So what we do after we ingest the images into ISIS is that we have to find out where they overlap with each other. What that means is that we can't do any control work where there's just one image. We have to control it to something, so we do image-to-image control first. This is done in ISIS with find image overlaps. It's single-threaded, it has no tree structure, and it has enormous RAM and CPU requirements when there are lots of overlaps. We put a portion of the South Pole through this, and after 3 weeks and about a quarter terabyte of RAM with no end in sight, it just crashed the computer. Now, ISIS wasn't built to handle that kind of data, so we looked for Python alternatives. In this case, we found Python's Shapely library. It can employ a tree structure, which means that if we have 2 images that are separated by a large amount of real estate, it doesn't even bother to compare those two to look for overlaps. It knows that they're too far apart. Those kinds of optimizations means that even on a modest computer with thousands of CTX images with hundreds of thousands of overlaps, we can do this find image overlaps process with these Python tools in a few hours. So that's one kind of efficiency we've built in. The next step is that once we've found those overlap areas, we have to make candidate tie points in them. In ISIS, the method to do this is usually with AutoSeed, which is single-threaded, and what it does is it makes candidate points in a grid. Now, there's no guarantee of any exact grid location being better than another, and if you have a coarse grid, it can miss important, small overlaps, or images entirely, actually, if you have a large range of pixel scales, like for MDIS around Mercury or Cassini ISS. But if the grid is too dense to try to capture those images, then it can take a really long time to analyze because you have so many points. What we've done is that we've employed a different method. Every overlap area is analyzed in its own thread, and we only analyze those that increase the area covered by a significant amount. Because each overlap area is in its own thread, then that lets us multi-thread the process pretty well. What we do is we create candidate points at random in the overlap shape in order to try to get at those nooks and crannies. We also require a minimum number of points in the overlap shape so we can get those small overlaps and get those sometimes critical points, but we also cap it at a maximum. So even if we have a large overlap area, we're only going to have up to about 24 points on it in order to minimize the superfluous number of points, because you don't need all that many. You don't need thousands of points in a single overlap area. That's what we get by treating each overlap area as its own self. The next step is that we have to register those candidate tie points. In this case, we use the ISIS program called PointReg, but we apply some custom requirements. We use multiple template sizes to match features, and we require that the candidate measure for each point register to within half a pixel in multiple templates. While that does increase some time, it does save us more time than it uses now, but it saves us more time later because there's a better chance of accurate registration. It's not guaranteed by far, but it's a much better assurance that it's probably likely to be an accurate registration to a correct feature. With that in mind, while this is running, we do some manual effort. What we do is we work in Mars charts, or Mars quads are sometimes called. Mars is divided into 30 roughly equal areas, I guess, roughly 3% to 4% of Mars. And what we do is we make about 250 fully controlled points while all that stuff is running from the previous slide, or previous set of slides. We make these fully controlled points and we tie those points to the controlled Themis dataset or the controlled MOLA dataset in order to really provide a skeleton structure around which later steps can work, and to say that we can know that those points are going to be correct to begin with. The later steps of our code know to ignore those manual points when it does things like weeding out bad points or potentially points that have large residuals, or trying to refit them. It knows to treat those manual points in a special way. This takes a little more than 1 minute per point because it takes a while to register that 5 to 6 meter per pixel CTX against a 100 meter per pixel Themis image. Then what we do is we merge all of those different little control nets together into one network, and then we solve it using the ISIS program Jigsaw. Once we've run Jigsaw, it outputs a lot of diagnostic files that we can use. In ISIS, this validation step is pretty much all manual. You look at those, you try to figure out what's bad, you refit them, you do something, you put it back in through Jigsaw and do all of these steps. Our alternative is automated. We call it affectionately the skimmer because we take a little off the top each time. What we do is we use those ISIS Jigsaw outputs. We take the worst residual points from the solution, we extract or skim them from the network, we try to re-register them with different template sizes, put them back in the network, rerun Jigsaw, and we repeat this until the residuals are less than some desired value. What we also have is that we require that the skimming residual value decrease each time. And if it gets to be too small, in this case about 0.95 pixels, what we do is we exit the skimmer anyway and say, you should take a look at this because there are still a few points more than we wanted that have high residuals. The output, the final result, once we're all done, is something that looks like this. What you're seeing is Mars chart 25. It's a mid-southern latitude area. It's a real pain to do manually. We've done it, or at least some parts of it manually, because you have seasonal changes, you have lots of dust storms, you have clouds, you have various things that make matching these features hard. But our code pulled through like a charm. What you're seeing in red are the image footprints for images that are just in this region. Blue are footprints of images that are in adjacent regions as well, and so we can merge adjacent regions without any manual effort. Each of the small green points are our control points, and you can see that the point density varies significantly across it because of how, again, we treat those area overlaps individually. We have some overdense regions which will be thinned. We have a custom thinning code that we will apply to this network. We haven't done it in this example because we wanted to explore a worst case scenario. We've also pointed out some of the fully controlled points that are scattered throughout the area, and this was before we imposed the 250 goal. In this case, we only have 83, but when we would go back, we would add to those numbers of points. With that in mind, our concluding remarks is that first off, this is doable. I want to emphasize that this is something that works. Our methods can control an entire non-polar Mars chart in about 1 to 2 weeks on a high-end personal computer. So again, that is about 3,000 to 4,000 images, or somewhere around 1.5 to 3 terabytes of image data. It can pull through that in a week or so. The non-polar regions, fine. Polar regions take more like a month or two. That's because there are a lot more images by almost an order of magnitude, but also because you have seasonal changes that just make everything much harder to do. But again, our code can do it, and it takes about 1 to 2 months. Our current output plans, we are planning to release some of the work that we've done with Mars in papers later this year in 2021 and next year 2022. For future work, we're proposing to PDART in order to do a more consistent job with Mars with the CTX and more validation. And we are proposing to produce Cassini end-of-mission mosaics for the mid-sized Saturnian satellites. We'd also be more than happy to collaborate with you on your project of interest. Please feel free to contact me. My contact information is in the upper left. And thank you for your time.